Good evening, everyone. My name is David Shayevitz, and I'm a professor of Jewish history here at Northwestern and director of the Crown Family Center for Jewish and Israel Studies. And it's a real pleasure for me to welcome all of you tonight to the latest installment of our annual Renee and Lester Crown Speaker Series. Our topic tonight is Jewish and Israeli cuisine and culture. I'm so excited to introduce our speakers, but before I do, and before we kick things off, let me just say a word or two about the Crown Family Center and acknowledge some of the people who have who've made tonight's event possible. So for those who have not been to our events in the past, the Crown Family Center for Jewish and Israel Studies is an academic hub within Northwestern University for undergraduate and graduate education, faculty and student research, and for engaging and accessible public programming. Our students, affiliated faculty members, visiting professors, postdoctoral fellows, and others study, teach, and research Jewish history, Jewish philosophy and thought, Hebrew and Yiddish language and literature, Holocaust studies, and the history, politics, and culture of the State of Israel. Part of what makes the Crown Center unique among Northwestern's many departments and programs is our dedication to communal engagement and to building bridges between the university and the wider public. And tonight's event is one of several upcoming programs that aim to strengthen this connection. We're going to be putting into the chat a link to our website. Please take a look. You can find there information about upcoming events. You can find information about how to get on our mailing list or find us on social media, as well as information about how to partner with us with a donation of any size to allow us to continue offering rigorous and rich and engaging programming for the Chicagoland community and beyond in the future. Tonight, it's especially appropriate for me to acknowledge two particular supporters, namely Renee and Lester Crown, whose visionary leadership and generosity over the years has transformed Jewish studies at Northwestern from a small program first established in the 1980s to today, a major academic center focused on Jewish and Israel studies with over a dozen affiliated full-time faculty members, a robust group of visiting scholars and postdoctoral fellows, an undergraduate major, 2 undergraduate minors, a graduate cluster, and dozens of annual courses enrolling hundreds of students each year. In 2012, when a group of friends of Renee and Lester Crown decided to give a gift to Northwestern in honor of the Crown's leadership, they fittingly decided not to commission a plaque or a fountain or some other kind of physical monument, but instead to reinvest in Jewish learning and Jewish culture. And the result was the Crown Speaker Series, which each year brings a lecturer to campus, or this year to Zoom, and has featured an array of really eminent authors and intellectuals who have profoundly enriched Jewish culture on campus. And our speakers tonight are no exception. I'm thrilled to be able to introduce Michael Solomonov and Stephen Cook, who are the co-owners of the nationally beloved and trailblazing Philadelphia hospitality group Cook and Solo, and who are champions of Israel's extraordinarily diverse and vibrant culinary landscape. Between the two of them, they've been awarded 3 James Beard Foundation awards. Mike has been awarded 2 additional awards for his work as the chef of Zahav restaurant in Philadelphia. Those awards include Outstanding Chef in 2017. And in 2019, that restaurant, Zahav, their flagship Israeli restaurant, became the first Israeli restaurant and the first Philadelphia restaurant to win the James Beard Outstanding Restaurant Award. Zahav was also recognized in 2018 by Food and Wine magazine as one of the 40 most important restaurants of the past 40 years. And I've got a long list of other honorifics, but in the interest of time and to actually have a chance to speak with them rather than just share these honors with you, I'm going to cut that list short. I will mention, however, that their other restaurants include Federal Donuts, Dizengoff, Goldie, Kfar, Merkaz, Abe Fisher, Laser Wolf, and if you're sensing a pattern from the names of these restaurants, so Jewish and Israeli cuisine are really close to their hearts. And the two of them have also authored together 3 highly acclaimed cookbooks. Zahav, I have my copy here, A World of Israeli Cooking. Hopefully you can't see the grease stains on it because I keep this close to the stove in the kitchen. It's been well used. Israeli Soul, Easy, Essential, Delicious, and a book that I don't have a copy of handy, Federal Donuts, The Partially True Spectacular Story. We're going to hear much more about their career and about their work over the course of our time together. And so let me just give you a sense of what the next hour and change is going to consist of. We're going to start with a conversation between myself and Mike and Steve. After that, we're going to turn things over to my colleague, Claire Sufrin, who's the Assistant Director of Jewish Studies at Northwestern. She's going to help us moderate some audience Q&A. So as we're speaking, if you do have questions, if there are things you want to learn more about, please do put them in the Q&A that you can find a link to at the bottom of your screen. And we're going to be going through those questions and posing them as we proceed. So Mike and Steve, thank you so much for joining us. It's really a pleasure to have you with us. I'm sorry that it can only be in this virtual format, but I know there's been tremendous enthusiasm on the part of our community to get to learn from you. So let me start by just asking you to tell us, for those who have not read your cookbooks as carefully, a little bit about yourselves. And Mike, maybe we can start with you. Can you just share with us a bit about sort of what your path has looked like, how you came to be a chef, how you came to focus on Israeli cuisine in particular, what that trajectory has looked like?
Well, thank you guys so much for having us, albeit virtually. But it's really cold in Philly, so I would imagine Chicago is a lot colder. So maybe it's better this way. But so I was born in Israel. I grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and we moved back to Israel, and we made Aliyah when I was like 15, and I got the sort of bug then. When I left and came back to Pittsburgh after that, there was something that was just sort of different, and whatever life I thought was like normal and something that I sort of idealized was gone, right? And so I had this sort of back and forth with Israel. It ended up, I dropped out of university and ended up getting a job at a bakery in a town called Kfar Saba, which is just north of Tel Aviv. And I became a short order cook after that. And then I went to culinary school in Florida. And I moved to Philly and I worked at some of the, I worked at a really awesome French American restaurant and then Italian restaurant. And then Steve hired me to work at his restaurant, Marigold Kitchen. And we became really close. And I think that for many different reasons, we just thought that opening an Israeli restaurant would be cool. It was part of our heritage. And at the time, if you wanted to be a cool chef or restaurateur, you went to Spain, you went to Italy, you dissected and emulsified and clarified all these there are all these techniques. And, you'd go to Israel and eat fresh laffa, 20 different salads that explained so much culturally, and kebabs and all that. And we were like, this is what people want to eat. So we opened Zahav in 2008, and yeah, that the rest is history.
The rest is history. So let me ask you one follow-up, which is that one of the things that I think makes especially the Zahav, the cookbook, so unique, is that in addition to all the sort of culinary guidance and the recipes, the reader really gets to know not just you but your family. There are these different vignettes and the different chapters, and I hope you don't mind me asking. One of the characters who really plays in the book a pivotal role in your journey is your brother. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about how he, the experience of your family factored into the direction that you took into Israeli cuisine.
David, my little brother David, was born in the States, was born in Pittsburgh, and then we moved back to Israel, and I didn't assimilate, right? I went to an American boarding school for a year, and then I came back to the States and kind of went back and forth, and David just became Israeli. And after high school, he went to the army and served in the Golani unit and was a sniper. And then we got to bond a few years later, right before his release. It was when I was working at the Italian restaurant, and we closed for a few weeks in the summer, and it coincided with David's break, right before you are done with military service in the IDF, you get like a little vacation. And so my mom flew me back to Israel under the condition I would cook dinner for her friends. So David and I spent a few weeks hanging out, partying, and just really bonding, but also cooking this meal. And then a month later, or 2 months later, I guess, on Yom Kippur, 3 days before his release, he was killed by Hezbollah snipers. And that, I think upon reflection was probably the catalyst for something much greater. And this sort of attachment to Israel and advocacy for Israel, it just became important.
Thank you. Thank you. Let me bring Steve into the conversation because Steve, I know you two have had a kind of a circuitous route that brought you to, becoming a restaurateur and a cookbook author. And so maybe you can tell us about your own background. I don't know if you ever saw yourself, at an earlier stage becoming a magnate of Israeli cooking and Israeli cuisine. But maybe you can, give us a little bit of background to your own journey.
Sure. Yeah, I can honestly say I did not ever think that I would end up making a career out of Israeli food. I grew up, but I did grow up in South Florida, which is suburban Israel. So I feel like I got a good start. My father was a rabbi, which I think for a lot of, not all, my brother's a rabbi too, but for some children of rabbis, it can present a complicated relationship with Judaism. And so um, early in life, I kind of ran away from it as fast as I could. I ended up in Philadelphia to go to Wharton as an undergrad, pursuing a career in finance, which I did for about 6 years after I graduated. I lived in New York and I worked on Wall Street. And I think I knew literally the first day sitting in my cubicle, my first day on the job, that it wasn't going to be the career for me. But it took me 6 years to sort of work up the courage to find something that I did love. I had always loved to cook. I think if my connection to Judaism was, I think, strongest through the food. I think, um, and the memories of the food growing up. And so I decided to go to culinary school. I went to culinary school at night while I was working, and really just fell in love with it. And moved back to Philly in 2001. I think the same year that Mike moved back. We both moved to Philly the same year. We actually had apartments that were literally next door to each other, literally,
Hmm.
but never met. And I started cooking in restaurants in Philly. It was a second career for me at the time, so I felt sort of in a rush to get where I was going, and I opened a little small restaurant that Mike referenced called Marigold Kitchen as the chef. Um, Figured out a year later that I loved restaurants, but maybe the life of a chef wasn't for me. And that's how Mike and I met. We met through my wife, who had grown up in Pittsburgh with Mike, and we were the two Jewish line cooks in Philadelphia at the time. The industry has become more Jewish, but at the time, being a line cook was just another way to disappoint your mother if you were Jewish. And so Mike and I started working together. He came on board and took over and did things that I could never do in the kitchen. And it wasn't that first restaurant wasn't a busy restaurant or a successful restaurant. So we had a lot of time, Mike and I, to just sit and talk. And Mike had this vision for this Israeli restaurant, which, it's sort of a little bit hard to imagine in 2021 with Israeli food taking off in America. But at the time, there wasn't anything. And Mike had this really clear vision, and we would talk and talk and talk about it. And, just to sort of shut him up, we just decided to do it. And I think we really like working together, and we sort of hit on something that was personal to both of us, and I think that's the reason our restaurants are Israeli and Jewish, because that's what we know, and that's what we're able to express in an authentic way, and have our guests sort of feel that expression directly.
So apropos, Israeli cuisine and the sort of meteoric rise in the United States, but I mean, really in Philadelphia especially. So I'm a Penn alum, and there was no Israeli culinary scene when I was in Philadelphia, unfortunately. I know that you guys now have a restaurant actually right adjacent to the Penn campus. And I think if it had been there when I was in school, I probably would have spent every day there. So I missed out on that, unfortunately. But it really shows what a surprising, I would say, rise in terms of the general awareness of Israeli cuisine, how that's taken off. And I wonder what the two of you attribute that to. Why is it that Israeli cooking, not only your own restaurants, but there are a number of other celebrated restaurateurs who have taken Israeli cuisine mainstream. What do you think it is that has made this moment so receptive?
I think that, I'm trying to remember what Steve wrote in our business plan, to try to like gather money from friends. And what did we say? We said that it was this mysterious cuisine that represented not only the Middle East, but Mediterranean and Jewish diaspora. It was something that nobody else was doing, right? And what we knew of Middle Eastern restaurants, unless you lived in like suburban Detroit or maybe Anaheim, it was like not good, like Arabic food. And I think there was like a hummusia in New York that was opened maybe by an Israeli, but wasn't really run by an Israeli after that. So there just wasn't great representation of, forget about Israeli food, Middle Eastern food. And I think that Israelis were, for a time, probably embarrassed. I don't think that the idea of having a national cuisine was something that they ever really considered, because they were going through this metamorphosis of wanting to be great chefs, which meant cooking European food. It would meant if you were an Israeli in Israel and you wanted to go be a famous chef, you would go to Japan or you'd go somewhere in Europe, and then you'd open up like a sushi restaurant in Tel Aviv. And you would do that when one safta was like Iraqi, one was Yemenite, one was Bulgarian, and one was Moroccan. And your Shabbat meal was just so much more stimulating than that. So I think people were embarrassed. And I think that even Israelis that would open kind of Israeli restaurants in the United States called it like Mediterranean or something like that. So I think I guess we were maybe naive or confident enough that there was something there that nobody had really done before. And we wanted to be the people to bring it.
I guess, to what do you attribute, I mean, other than the quality of your food, and that goes without saying, and your efforts, I guess, what do you think made this moment one in which people would be receptive to this style of cooking? What is it about Israeli cuisine, do you think, that is capturing non-Israelis all over the United States and beyond?
I mean, I think the big picture is that Israeli cuisine has ridden this wave that stretches back, 30 years in this country, with the sort of awakening of Americans that you can have great food that doesn't have, French or Italian names on the menu. Like Mike said, both of us coming up as cooks, look back at the list of restaurants that I wanted to work at when I moved to Philly in 2001. They were mostly French and a couple Italian and sort of continental restaurants. I remember one of my first jobs in the industry was in high school. I was a busboy at a northern Italian restaurant. And at the time, that was revolutionary, that somebody would take a region of Italy and focus on it. And I think there's just been over time a growing curiosity and interest of American diners about, okay, what's new, what's next. We saw it in Philly with tapas. It had a moment before Zahav opened. And, now I think, Mike mentioned, Israeli chefs maybe being a little bit embarrassed about where they came from previously. But now I think it's really turned on its head. I think the cooks are sort of rejecting that sort of French orthodoxy, and they're saying, where am I from? Like, what did I grow up eating, and how can I share that? And I think it's coming from both directions. It's coming from the cooks and it's coming from the diners, and they're both getting a little bit, they're both dipping their toes into new waters and excited and curious about it. And, Israeli food has a lot of great things going for it. It's both exotic and accessible at the same time. It's very healthy. It's Mediterranean food, and Mike talks very eloquently about this, and I'm sure that he will here. It's not just one or two things. It's not Arabic food. It's not Jewish food. It's literally hundreds of cuisine. So there's a lot of territory to explore, which is part of why we've been able to take it apart in Philadelphia and sort of cherry pick certain things for certain restaurants, and not, continue to find new things, new parts of the cuisine that we can explore.
So, this is anticipating exactly where I was hoping to take you guys, which is, and I'll just give a drop of backstory. So, Mike, you were in a documentary that I highly recommend to anybody who's listening tonight. It's called In Search of Israeli Cuisine. It's not a good documentary to watch, as I did, while, between meals, while you're hungry, because it's just like, you're salivating the whole time as you watch it. But the question that, over the course of your travels and your interviews and your cooking in that documentary, the question that you ask so many of your interlocutors is, what is Israeli cuisine? Is there such a thing as Israeli cuisine? And one of the things I found so fascinating is, you're interviewing journalists and chefs and all these different, sort of sampling of Israeli people. And some of them say, yes, there absolutely is an Israeli cuisine. Some say, no, we're much too young to even have a sort of an integrated, independent cuisine. And given all of those different roots, all of those different, trajectories of different kinds of food cultures that fuse together in Israeli cuisine that Steve mentioned, I wonder, what did you come away from that experience? What was the answer? Did you find Israeli cuisine? Is there such a thing that transcends the sum of its parts?
The answer is yes, that there is. And I think that national cuisine, there's no such, there's no actual national cuisine. Everything comes from everywhere. But to the extent that, if you accept that there is Israel and that there is Israeli culture, then you accept that there is Israeli cuisine. I guess I thought it was really, it's just, and that was, I don't even know when we filmed that. I mean, that was in 2013, right? That was a long time ago in terms of food trends, and so much has happened in Israel, but there absolutely is an Israeli cuisine. And I think that it's funny because it's evolving, right? But what it's doing is looking back further, right? We're like getting, like we're discovering and going and delving further into the diaspora of where we come from and reviving food traditions that don't exist anywhere else, right? They're the Libya and the the food from Tripoli, the Jewish food from Tripoli, Libya, is the only place that exists right now. Basically, is Israel. I mean, probably a little bit in France or whatever, but like generally speaking, Tunisian Jewish food. There's 1,000 Tunisian Jews in Tunisia, right? And so they're either in Paris or they're in Israel. And Yemen, I mean, there probably are 0 Jews in Yemen. I just think that, you can't, and the huge argument, and I'm sort of jumping around here, the huge argument that I get is political, right? Is that this is stolen cuisine, that hummus isn't Jewish, and that without either loosely or very deliberately recognizing the influence of Palestinian cooking, it's this, which I understand, I totally get it, but I don't think that it's accurate. I think that it is not just a stolen cuisine. And if you say that it is simply this or that, what you're doing is basically erasing the way that like Palestinian chefs, again, I totally understand this, feel like Jewish or Israeli cuisine erases Palestinian culture. If you flip it and you go the other sort of, you let the pendulum swing the other way, what you're doing is saying that like the thousands of years of diaspora, the migration, inquisitions, all the pogroms, all of this settling, transporting, transmitting, all of kashrut, right? Because that is this isn't just the food, the Jewish food that you eat in Israel from Yemen isn't just Yemeni food. It's through the laws of kashrut and Shabbat and Rosh Hashanah and all these things that we have to celebrate that are around food. So if you say that there's no such thing as Israeli food, you're actually you're erasing Jewish history as well. And I don't, that's not gonna like happen under my watch.
So that's really, really well said. I think I'll just note for our audience members who may have noticed that we lost a participant. Steve is having some internet connection issues, and we're hoping to get him back on as quickly as we can. In the meantime,
he knew that there were going to be challenging questions, and so he shut up.
He didn't want to have to weigh in on the hot button issues. Hopefully, we'll get a chance to pin him to the wall when he gets back. But I mean, since we went in this direction, so let me ask you. I think this is really sort of eloquent the way that you're addressing. Sometimes this is called the hummus wars, right? Or these debates over food and indigeneity.
Which is ridiculous, right? Because it's not like, I don't think, I mean, everybody sort of owns hummus, right? And, I don't think actually the Palestinians invented hummus, but if you notice in the first scene of the documentary, when we go to this restaurant, this place Busi, this Shipudia in Shchonot Tikva, we're pointing around and I'm like, sort of articulating this like all this diversity that we have. And I point to hummus and say it's Palestinian, right? Because I think that it's important to recognize that like the contribution that Palestinian contribution to Israeli food is of the utmost importance, right? And but like falafel, you know, if you want to like argue about Israel, you can point to falafel and get really upset. The reality is Coptic Christians invented falafel in the 4th century. Okay, like so we're all stealing it from Coptic Christians that probably made it to not serve Lent or not to have meat on Lent, you know? And I think in general, especially in Arabia or in the Middle East or the Mediterranean, there was so much appropriation. There was so much occupation. I mean, the Ottomans are the ones that actually did all of the spreading of food mostly. So I think this is something that we, you know, have certainly learned a lot more about. I mean, I certainly have from the film. One of my closest friends in the world is a Palestinian cookbook author, and it has certainly changed the way that I think about things. But I don't think that like, you know, labeling Israeli cuisine as something that is like farcical is useful. I think that's just, I just think it's bullshit. You know, I don't believe it.
Yeah. So I guess let me turn the question on its head then. You know, in one of the things that I really love about the cookbooks is that you are highlighting restaurants and chefs, Palestinians, Israeli Arab chefs. And I wonder what your experience has been like using food and cuisine and the sort of, you know, cultural underpinnings to bridge barriers, to sort of cross boundaries that otherwise might exist. Do you see that happening in Israel? Have you seen that happening in your career?
It's hard. I don't know. I feel like whenever there's any sort of step forward, you're always reminded that there's like plenty of haters out there that actually don't want any sort of progress. So I think it's really, really challenging for many reasons. And Steve can probably speak to this a lot more eloquently than I can. But I think that I think the majority of people on both sides want the same thing. And I think that, I just think there's this sort of cultural and societal pressure that sometimes, and political, obviously, pressures that don't really allow that to happen. I think food is, and I years ago would have made fun of myself for saying this, like this image of like, I'm going to be the American Israeli that like makes challah and we break it and like there's freaking peace. Like, no, that's not going to happen. On the other hand, what we've all sort of come to realize is that a lot of the people, a lot of diplomats, a lot of politicians that really should have the best interest of their citizens and societies in mind, they're not doing the job that they should be doing. And in a way, I think food diplomacy, you know, I think that it could help. I think it could be more effective than some of the sort of public policies. So I don't think we're gonna like make a loaf of challah or bake pita and like start strumming like kumbaya. On the other hand, there's something so utterly human about cooking and hospitality in particular, and inviting people in and sitting down to your table. And we see that, you see that in Israel all the time. You see that here in the United States on so many different sort of levels or platforms. I think that it's something that we have to pursue.
Yeah, Steve, welcome back. If you wanted to jump in, I wanted to give you a chance.
Thanks. Yeah, we had a power outage here for a minute, but yeah, just to piggyback on something that Mike said, I mean, just connecting it to our careers, I think most people assume that we got, you know, that the business is about, you know, the success of our business is about the quality of the food, and that's certainly a key element in it. And especially since Mike and I both entered the industry through the kitchen as chefs. But really, I think when you ask us what our business is, I think we would both agree that it's more about the hospitality side than it is about the food. I view our job as like someone comes into Zahav for a 3-hour meal, or they come into Federal Donuts for a donut and a cup of coffee. Are they leaving our premises feeling slightly better about the world and about themselves than they did when they came in? You know, whether they know that quick interaction with the counter person, that human interaction, or, you know, the longer interaction maybe with the server at the restaurant. You know, we want to make people feel more human, feel better about the world. And food is and hospitality, it's disarming. when you sit down and you talk to somebody over food, it disarms people. And you know, we haven't we haven't found peace in the Middle East through food yet, but I would say one of the things that I've learned from working with Mike all these years is, you know, we talk all day long, and we talk about all the problems that the business faces. And, you know, I come to Mike with a problem and he's like, well, why don't you just sit down and have a cup of coffee with this person? As much as that's 180 degrees from my natural instinct, like, he's always right. You sit down with the person, it really, you put a face to any conflict, and it just makes solving it easier. And so we haven't got there yet with Mideast diplomacy, but maybe one day.
Just a few more cups of coffee. That's really nicely put. Thank you. Let me turn us from Israeli food and Israeli cuisine maybe to some questions about Jewish food. One of the things, as somebody who is himself of, you know, personally of Ashkenazi origins, but a great lover of Sephardi and Mizrahi, right, of the kind of food that you guys mostly cook. Maybe you can speak a little bit about sort of that balance in your restaurants in Israeli culture. There's, I know one restaurant you've opened recently, Abe Fisher, which sort of does this elevated take on some of the Ashkenazi classics, but it seems like it's in the minority of what you guys spend your time cooking. And I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about, you know, how you approach that divide in the Jewish culinary tradition.
Well, I think that when we're talking about Israeli food in general, I feel like everybody likes Sephardic and Mizrahi cooking, and that's kind of like how you sell it. I mean, I grew up, Steve is 100% Ashkenazi, I'm half. I just don't think that Ashkenazi has got the good press that it deserves. I found this out in Israel. This guy Shmuel Holland, who was from Poland or Hungary, and he was like, we would forage for wild mushrooms and there were berries and this and that, but a lot of the early immigrants to especially North America from that were of Ashkenazi descent came with absolutely nothing, and there just wasn't access to great stuff. So I think that we have an emotional connection to Ashkenazi food. I think there is good Ashkenazi food. I think that it's like maybe a harder sell to the West to get past this idea that all the food is like bland, heavy, or smells like raw onions. I don't know.
Yeah, I think we write a little bit about it in Israeli Soul, and it's like, you know, the question to ask is Sephardic food just better than Ashkenazi food? I think that's like some people would probably say yes, like, you know, is Paul Simon just better than Art Garfunkel? But you know, but I'd still say like my last meal is going to be a pastrami sandwich. So it's I think when, you know, I think that as Mike said, like when you know, European Jews immigrated, you know, especially post-war to Israel, in a lot of cases they really intentionally wanted to leave behind where they had just come from. So I think that's a big element in sort of like how Sephardic food has become, you know, it became dominant in Israel. That was what was, you know, the raw ingredients that were, you know, in the climate of Israel were more conducive to the foods that were cooked by the Sephardic immigrants. So, you know, and I think especially now, from a sort of health conscious perspective, Sephardic food can be perceived as healthier. As Mike said, with our restaurant, A Fisher, which is elevated Ashkenazi food, we're constantly sort of fighting the stereotype that it's just sort of heavy and you need a nap afterwards. But there's a lot of richness to mine, and I think you can, you know, with a lot of American Jews in particular, like that food really strikes a chord. So it might not be something people want to eat every single day, but there is that connection there for many American Jews, for the Ashkenazi food.
So here I just have to say as an aside that one of those American Jews got in touch with me after we started publicizing this talk and asked me if I could please put in a plug that you should start serving cholent at one of your restaurants. I don't know if that's in the plans, but maybe there's some demand for some of the Ashkenazi classics. So let me ask you another Jewish food question, which is that there actually has been a sort of mini controversy over the last couple of weeks that I'm sure that you've been asked to weigh in on in the past. It was the subject of a editorial in the New York Times. Was a Hamantash recipe in Bon Appetit, and it raised a question for those who are listening in who weren't aware of this. Some quick Googling will turn this up, but it raised a question again of sort of ownership. Who has sort of the right to weigh in on Jewish food? In this case, it was somebody who was not a Jewish author who was saying, here's a better, how to build a better Hamantashen. And there's been a lot of sort of, heat and very little light on both sides. I wonder, what you make of this kind of question about, who has a right to weigh in or to define what is and is not Jewish food or good Jewish food.
I mean, isn't the whole point the argument? Like, isn't the point to have something to talk about, something as unimportant as Hamantashen or as important as Hamantashen? I mean, I think that I don't know. I think anybody has a right to weigh in. I don't know. Sometimes people are surprised, like people ask us for recipes often with the sort of expectation that the recipes are somehow a secret and we're not going to share them. Food is for sharing. We don't believe that you should have to have some sort of membership card to cook a certain type of food. I happen to love my mother's Hamantashen, so much so that like whenever we make Hamantashen in the restaurant, I sort of insist that we use that recipe. But that's partly because they're great and partly because that's what I grew up with. And I think you can't, it's a subjective thing. And I think the fun is in the debating of it, not in trying to like settle it definitively.
So we're just about out of time for this segment of our conversation. So maybe now we should turn things over to audience Q&A. I can see that there's a whole bunch of questions that have been building up. So I think I'll thank both Mike and Steve so much for a really fascinating and illuminating conversation, and ask Claire Sufrin, who's my colleague at Northwestern, if she can join us on screen. There she is. And Claire, I know, has been collecting some questions from our audience. And I know there's some eagerness to add more questions into the mix. So Claire, take it away.
Sure. Thanks so much, David. And thanks, Mike and Steve, for everything you've said so far. We've got a number of people who are curious in different ways about kashrut, about the Jewish dietary laws. And Mike, you made a point that really struck me, that no matter where its roots might be in the world, that all Jewish food is filtered through the dietary laws. So for example, Jewish recipes will typically not mix milk and meat. So people are curious, how do you approach the kosher laws, how they influenced your thinking about Israeli food, both like what you cook for yourself, but also what happens in the restaurants, plural.
Yeah, that is a great question. And that was a really big debate when we opened Zahav, right? Because I don't keep kosher in my house. Steve does more so than I do. But we decided, like, well, what do we do when we're trying to introduce Israeli food, not just Arabic food or not just whatever, like Jewish food to people? And I always use like roast lamb as the example, right? Because if you're cooking sort of quasi Middle Eastern or Mediterranean food and you roast lamb, you always make some sort of yogurt or like Lebanese sauce with it. In Israel, you wouldn't do that. You would have trina, right? And there was that sort of limitation and that parameter and that thing that helped define Israeli food for us. So we decided at that moment that we weren't going to mix milk and meat at Zahav, and we weren't going to have treif. Like, we have no treif. We have no shrimp, we have no bacon, we have no pork, we have none of that. And we don't serve milk and meat, and it's kind of like jarring for a lot of our cooks here. And then every now and then, if we like win an award or do well, we'll get Szechuan takeout for staff meal, and like people go crazy because it's like, oh my God, shrimp and pork, But that for us was a way to be definitive about the way that we were going to explain Israeli food. And actually, with the exception of Abe Fisher, which is more Ashkenazi, we do serve like a little milk and meat. And we had a little play on treif when we first opened, just, because we all have a personal relationship to kashrut. I just was explaining this to somebody the other day. I was like, we would never have like bacon, or we would never have pork in the house. No, right? Growing up, like conservative Jewish in Pittsburgh, you would never go to a restaurant and have a pork chop, but we would absolutely eat shrimp scampi 5 feet away from my front door, like on the street, right? So when we opened Dave Fisher, we're like, we need a little bit of like Chinese takeout on Christmas Eve on our menu, right? And so we had like, I think Steve, we had like fried rice or salami or something like that. But so we do try to keep it real a little bit with that. And we do think that if you are going to help identify Israeli cuisine versus like other Arabic cuisines, I think it is a distinguishing factor.
You're reminding me, just to be clear, my understanding is that there are dishes that are dairy and dishes that are meat, but there's not one dish that has both. And in some ways that's the best situation, because sometimes half your family wants dairy food and half your family wants meat food. And, someone's always going to lose out when you're dealing with a kosher system.
But but furthermore, I think that when you are a cook and you are roasting a piece of meat, to rest it or to baste it in butter is, of course, delicious. Everybody loves it. It's the way that we've been taught. What we want to introduce is this ratio of like lamb fat to charcoal to za'atar to the trina to like what is part of our lineage and our history, right? We are trying to tell stories that go in some cases to medieval Spain, that go from the Pale, to right now. And we don't want to interfere and mess with like European technique that doesn't belong into like this story or this narrative.
So like many people, I've been on like a babka baking journey over the pandemic, and I see that same debate happening in all the different babka recipes, right? Do you laminate your babka and put butter between all the layers and turn it into a French pastry? Or are you baking something that is much simpler that really any homemaker could bake? So I appreciate that. I'm curious, for both of you, looking at the larger, restaurant empire, what makes them American? We've talked a lot about what makes them Jewish, but what makes them American? Because that's another, you're in Philly, which is one of the most, original American cities. So how does that influence your cooking and your hospitality?
Well, I mean, the easiest answer to that is to just take a look at Federal Donuts, which is serves fried chicken and donuts. We try to throw in a few Jewish things into it, but it's a pretty American concept. I mean, the colors of the company are the colors of the American flag. I mean, I think this is going to sound overly simplistic, but and I'll let Mike kind of elaborate on this specific to Zahav. But I mean, they're American because they're in America. They're Philadelphian because they're in Philadelphia. We don't have the same products. Like we go to Israel, we get inspired by restaurants that we eat at. In some cases we flat out rip them off, but they don't end up tasting like they taste in Israel. Maybe sometimes they're better, more often they're not, but they taste like Philadelphia because that's the product that we're using, and that's the style of service that Americans are used to giving and receiving. And I think that comes across mostly at Zahav, the way that Mike has kind of taken the spirit of Israeli cuisine, but adapted it to what is available to us here in Eastern Pennsylvania.
Is there an ingredient that you can't get here that you would do anything to be able to get? Or at this point in globalization, it's just finding somebody to send it and having the money to pay for it?
I think that we talk all the time about the quality of eggplant that you get here. It's that you just have to manipulate it and do certain things. I mean, I think it could be any piece of produce, quite honestly. The Persian cucumbers that you get in the market in Israel that are from no less than 100 miles away, every single season. Tomatoes, I don't know. Steve, we discuss this all the time. Every time one of us goes to Israel, we like sending like pissed off WhatsApp messages like, why can't we just get this?
And I think also it changes the economics of it. I mean, it's one thing like for a few shekels in Israel to eat the freshest, flavorful produce that you've ever tasted. Like it's, that everybody can eat. You can do that here. You just have to charge a lot more money for it. And I think in that transaction, it changes the perception of that food.
Yeah, I mean, I was at Zahav once. It was when my youngest brother graduated from college, and we were all in Philly for the occasion. And I mean, I have such vivid memories of it because it was so special. I actually want to talk also about hummus, and this is coming a little bit from me and a little bit from the questions that we're seeing. One of the major changes between the two cookbooks is how quickly the hummus recipe goes. What happened? Well, first describe the two recipes for people who haven't studied the cookbooks, and then explain why each cookbook needed its own recipe.
So the Zahav cookbook has the Zahav recipe, which we spent a long time developing. It's fantastic. It just takes a lot of, not necessarily a lot of hands-on time, but a lot of pre-planning. You have to soak the chickpeas. You have to really cook the hell out of the chickpeas. You have to drain the chickpeas the right way. So it's a project, and it yields fantastic results. When we wrote Israeli Soul, we were really trying to, I mean, it's really gratifying to know how many people actually cook out of the Zahav cookbook. But one of the comments we got back was some of the recipes were just a big investment in time. So Israeli Soul was really about how to shortcut that. And we had for years railed against canned chickpeas, and then decided to just embrace them. But what we really wanted was that the 5-minute hummus recipe in Israeli Soul, which literally takes 5 minutes and is based on canned chickpeas. One of the like secret goals behind that recipe was to use an entire jar of tahina and then be done, and then just throw it away, because trying to emulsify tahina so that and measure it out is just a messy, dirty business. So that's one of the big differences too. You just use a whole jar, you pour it in, you don't have to measure it, and it's done in 5 minutes. And it's very, very good. It's not as good as the Zahav recipe, but it's a close second.
There's a jar of, like crumbly, gross tahina at the bottom in my refrigerator that feels you calling its name. Thank you. I've wondered. I've made both, and they are both delicious. I'm curious, how has Israeli cuisine in Israel changed over the time that we're talking about? We've talked a lot about how you've changed, or how you've participated in the changing of Israeli culture outside of Israel, sort of this elevating and all of that. But what have you seen? What are the trends in Israel that you've observed when you've traveled around? And I suspect we have a couple people who wouldn't be opposed if you name dropped some some restaurant recommendations.
Well, I think that people have embraced their lineage. I think that people have woken up to realize that cooking European food or food from elsewhere isn't as good as what they have in their backyard. And I think that they've also, sort of coinciding with us or the rest of the world, realized that there is something here and there's something to celebrate. Food tourism is now a thing in Israel, right? Like back in my parents', or even in the 80s, or whenever we would go on like school trips, there was nobody going to Israel for like food, and nobody going for wine, and nobody going because they wanted it. Actually, a perfect example is our buddy who owns Guetta, which is a Libyan restaurant in Jaffa, right? And he was cooking, I think, French food or something like that, and the restaurant was failing, and his grandmother said, why don't you cook like our food? The food from Tripoli, right? And so he makes the most incredible couscous you've ever had in your life. Guetta restaurant, everybody out there. And flights right now, if you are willing to gamble a little bit, $800 round trip. Okay. yeah, so the couscous is unreal, and the cherchi is like next level, and the preserved lemons are, what, 4 or 5 generations of. I mean, just it's incredible. So I think that people are really embracing that, and I think that people are not going to like fancy European restaurants the way that we're doing it here too. I mean, as Steve had mentioned before, if back in my day, if I wanted to go to like a nice restaurant, I'd go to like a Danielle or Charlie Trot, or like something. And I'm trying to think of Chicago. There was a French restaurant that was in Chicago before most of you people were born. That was like the precursor to Charlie Trotter, and there was like a helicopter landing pad, and it was like super French. And in Philly, we had George Perry, right, Lebec Finn, and those days are gone. So like eating on the street, standing up, gives you the food memories that you care more about than Michelin rated meals. So I think that people are embracing that, not just diners, but I think that restaurateurs, I think that operators really care about it. So, and I do actually think, and going back to what we were talking about food diplomacy, I think it's very easy for Israelis to accept Palestinian cuisine that way too, because like, quite honestly, those have been the favorite restaurants of Jewish Israelis. The Arab shipudia, or the Arab kebab shop, is like where every Jewish Israeli would eat on Shabbat if they were not Shomer Shabbat, and I think it's
It
just
was open.
always open. There's a restaurant in an incredible restaurant in what is the name of it? What's the artist colony, Steve? And there's eight, and it is. So there's artist colony that's north of Zichron. Oh, it's and behind
Hod.
is a Palestinian or like Palestinian Israeli village called Ein Hod, and the patriarch of that village opened a restaurant in the salon of his house, and then it became a restaurant called Bait, and he had used that restaurant to lobby to get electricity and infrastructure for his village, because all of the lawmakers in Israel on Fridays would go to his salon and eventually his restaurant and eat. So it took 5 years or something like that, but that's the way that his village became recognized. So there are dozens of restaurants like that, and I think that that's where this is also sort of semantics, but I feel like what's the cucumber tomato salad? What do we call that here? Cucumber, tomato, parsley, lemon, salt. What do we call it?
Israeli salad.
Israeli salad.
So a Jew in Israel, they call that an Arab salad, and maybe they have a little more tahina on the side, but I do think that there's something there.
So I'm going to jump back in, Claire, if that's okay, because two
Yeah,
of the last
please.
questions, two of these questions have come together in my mind, which is that so the Israeli soul 5-minute hummus has become our Friday afternoon pre-Shabbat, tradition in my house. And now, speaking about where Israeli Jews want to be going on Shabbat, what their traditions are. So, it makes me wonder what your traditions are with Mike and Steve. How do you cook at home when you're not cooking for guests, when you're not cooking, in the hospitality context? Do you have traditions or traditional foods that are part of, I don't know, your own Jewish or your own Israeli, families?
Yeah, vegetarian chicken nuggets over my sink. Right after we like him. No, Steve's got it. Steve's a
Well,
great.
I was just thinking about our like a very typical. My wife. I mean, I cook on the weekends, but my wife typically cooks Shabbat dinner for us every Friday, and she usually cooks this giant meal that always starts with matzo ball soup. And we have 4 kids, and they eat the matzo. They all eat the matzo ball soup, and then they get up from the table and don't eat any of the other food. So we end up having half of that food for lunch on Saturday. But they are that we've got a I mean, Mike and I both live a block from each other and away from each other in South Philly, where we have like an incredible Mexican and Southeast Asian immigrant community, and the restaurants around here, we eat a lot of Vietnamese food, we eat a lot of Mexican food, but we do always have matzo ball soup for Shabbat. Otherwise we hear it from the kids.
Yeah, I don't have, I'm typically working on Shabbat, but I think that actually one of our prep cooks and dishwashers makes tamales. Like he's like a private business. Probably makes more money than all of our restaurants combined. And he'll make like 700 tamales. And he does deliveries in South Philly. So my kids and I usually eat like chicken mole tamales Sunday morning from Rosie, who's good. But I don't know. My kids are now getting into cooking, which has been really, really fun. And we were stretching borekas together last time, which is like the best.
So I have to jump in just to let you know about 6 or 8 people have identified the restaurant for you. It's Le Francais in Wheeling, which is a suburb of Chicago. So I salute the memories of many of our audience members.
Job team.
And it looks like a number
No.
of others have put in requests for outposts of your empire here in Chicago. So when you're looking to expand, keep us in mind.
Yeah, we will.
Easy flights.
We love Chicago. Chicago, I will say, is like probably our favorite restaurant city. It's really wonderful, and you guys have great service. Everybody's so nice there, you know. And yeah, what I love about Chicago is similar to Philly. I feel like New York and San Francisco are so sort of prohibitive and so expensive, and there's this weird. I mean, it happens in every city, and there's classism obviously, and there's like, you know, sort of discrepancies between pay. But like in Philly, our servers and our bussers and like the owners and the chefs oftentimes have the same zip code as like our diners, you know. And I feel like there's something really welcoming about that. And I feel like Chicago, which is probably a bit more expensive than Philly, but it's not, like you can still live and you can still find places to eat that are reasonable. There are holes in the wall. There are places that are, you know, sort of dynastic and like generational. And I just feel like you guys have a great city, a great eating city. And Donut Vault, forget about it. When we won the Beard Awards, every single time, that's our treat, you know? We get up early in the morning and take an Uber to the Donut Vault and like get heartburn for like a day and a half afterwards.
But it was worth it.
Somebody just asked, what do you think about Galit in Chicago? Well, I was going to mention Galit is, you guys have a great Israeli restaurant in Chicago. The chef, Zach Engel, is a family friend of mine and cooked at Zahav before opening Shaya. So you guys have good Israeli.
So this is maybe opens to another question that we got that I was debating whether or not to bring up, which was, you know, do all of the high profile Israeli chefs get along? Are there rivalries between you and Yotam or Einat? Like, is there a camaraderie? Is there lack of relationship? How does it work when you do this for a job?
I don't know. I don't know. I think everybody kind of gets along, but everybody also, we're all insecure line cooks at the end of the day. Some of us Israeli. So
yeah.
we don't talk about Fight Club.
Yeah.
Sorry, I broke the rules.
No, I think that I'll, as much as I like to talk smack about people that I think maybe steal our recipes and techniques or whatever, I think that the sort of greater good in the fact that we're all part of a movement that has happened in our lifetime, something that we are actually part of, that represents and advocates for Israel positively, is worth or supersedes any sort of insecurity that I may have on a regular basis when I'm flipping through other people's cookbooks, you know?
Yeah. I know that the feeling of flipping, but maybe with a slightly different experience. Can you talk a little bit, you know, you've mentioned your staff quite a few times, and I think a lot of people would be interested to know a little bit more about, you know, who works for you? You know, do you have people with, coming in, Israelis working for you in the kitchen, people of all backgrounds? And then also, if you could talk a little bit about the pandemic and what that's meant for your business.
All right. Well, I'll start with the easy one, Steve. We have everybody that works for us. We have an extremely diverse background. I don't think that there are a ton of Israelis in Philly, but we definitely have had Israelis work for us. Couple in the kitchen, but we have literally everybody. I mean, restaurants are the sort of petri dish of humanity, which is fantastic. Our general manager and partner at Zahav started here. He's a Turkish immigrant and came here to the United States with like $700 in his pocket and is now an owner. And he's the best. So we have a lot of, it is a family. Um, and I don't know, pandemic restaurant, Steve, can you take this one and I'll have a power outage?
Yeah. Well, not surprisingly, a challenging year. I was saying earlier, I mean, on March 15th of 2020, we had 400 employees. And then on March 16th, we had 0. So right now we have about 200 and we're slowly sort of turning the lights back on. At the restaurants, we're not doing any indoor dining yet, but that's probably coming in April. So it was challenging. I mean, I think Mike and I both feel very fortunate. A lot of restaurants, people we know in Philly and else and around the country have permanently closed. There's a lot of casualties in our industry due to the pandemic, not to mention the incredible human toll. But we feel really lucky in that our businesses are going to come out alive. And as we're sort of trained to do just by the virtue of us being in the restaurant business and sort of having to always figure out, solve problems in the heat of the moment, like we're really like we'll never get another opportunity to remake our business this way. I mean, some of the changes that we've made in the last year when it comes to sort of quality of life and for ourselves and for our employees and compensation for our employees, we never would have been able to make those changes midstream with 400 people. And so what we've been talking about, I think, with our management team in the last few months, as we've started to see a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel, is like, let's just remember everything that we hated about our business in March of 2020, and let's just not do that again. So as bad as it's been on so many levels, we're trying to look at it like an opportunity to remake the company, and not repeat old mistakes and not fall into unhealthy patterns. We instituted a service charge at all the restaurants. We instituted a $15 an hour minimum wage at all the restaurants. Those are things that we're really proud of, that we always talked about doing, but kind of putting those in a 400 person company and not having not having pushback it just wasn't really feasible. But when you're starting over from 0, you can kind of do anything. So I think it's been a really challenging year, but I hope that we look back in 5 or 10 years and sort of see this as the beginning almost of a whole new company for us.
Thanks.
So let me ask one last question that has been submitted by one of our audience members. Somebody asked about whether you've experienced any kind of pushback or anti-Semitism, as such public faces for sort of ambassadors for Israel, people who, wear your sort of Jewish identity on your sleeves, so to speak. I know, Mike, that you're from Pittsburgh, or that you have roots in Pittsburgh, and obviously there's a personal dimension, I could imagine, to what happened there. Is this something that plays a role or has affected your business or your personal relationship to this phenomenon of anti-Semitism?
It hasn't affected our business. I do remember like the early, we didn't know what to call Zahav, and I think that, or we knew what to call it, but we didn't know how to describe it. And we said Israeli, and I think there was like maybe a publicist at one point. It was like, isn't that political? And which I understand. I think the easy answer is yes, of course, we're Jews. So yeah, we've experienced anti-Semitism, whether it's sort of passive or aggressive, it happens. There haven't been that many moments where I think it's really done more than just made us aware of the fact that we always kind of have to keep our guard up. I'm sure the same as all of you out there, right? I think that we all experience it one way or the other. And growing up in Squirrel Hill was like, it's like a shtetl, and there's like people. I thought that every American Jewish city had people speaking Yiddish in the streets, right? And there was still anti-Semitism, and Israel and the idea of Israel, I think, is an easy way for people to mask anti-Semitism and and make it like anti-Zionism or whatever, which is not which is like confusing. But I don't know. I'm not answering this totally, but Steve, have we experienced anti-Semitism?
Almost surprisingly, no. I mean, in terms of being, having our business targeted in any way, I mean, we've always, well, I don't know. No, I would say, we've always tried to use, the last several years have been, I think, for everybody more political than it had been. But I mean, we've always really tried to use Zahav just to be only positive about Israel and really just focus on everything that's wonderful about Israel. And yeah, I mean, I think we're proud of what we do. We're proud of what we represent, and there hasn't been a huge negative impact so far.
That's wonderful, and hopefully will continue. And I think that since we're coming up on our time, I think that I'll thank you so much for having been with us tonight. Thank you for all the work that you do, and for giving all of us in the audience, and for giving myself and Claire the chance to have this conversation and to learn more about your background. And I wish you all the best of luck going forward. And thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So for those in the audience, thank you so much to you as well for joining us. And please do have a look at our website to learn more about some of our upcoming program. And I hope to see all of you at future events by the Crown Center going forward. Have a wonderful night, everyone. Thank you so much.